been very good.
It's so fitting that I don't know if I'm
Refined the yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We're going to get started here. My name is Jasper Dent. I'm the events coordinator here at McNally Robinson in Saskatoon. This event is being held on Treaty 6 territory, the land of the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy by Owen Schalk and Eve Engler, published by BARAKA Books. Thank you to Owen Schalk and our guest host Ethan Klein for being here tonight and for working with us to create this event. Just a note before we get started, this event is being live streamed, so please just be mindful of the web camera to your right over there. I'd also like to take this time to encourage you all to silence your phones. You're probably sick of hearing it, but there's always one person who forgets. So, to get started, Owen Schalk is a writer based in rural Manitoba. He's the author of Canada in Afghanistan, a story of military, diplomatic, political, and media failure, 2003 to 2023, which was published by Lorimer in 2023. He's published articles in Alborada Monthly Review and Protean Magazine, and contributes a weekly column to Canadian Dimension. His fiction has been published by Quagmire Literary Magazine, Sobotka Literary Magazine, Vast Chasm Magazine, and more. And our host for tonight, Ethan Klein, is a Settler Master of Fine Arts in Writing candidate at the University of Saskatchewan, focusing on short stories and creative nonfiction. Ethan grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and currently lives in Saskatoon with his wife, dog, and 2 cats. We'll turn things over to them now. Please give them both a warm welcome.
Hello, everybody. I appreciate you all taking the time to come out to the launch tonight of Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy, which I co-authored with Eve Engler. This book is about Canada's role in overthrowing democracy around the world. It's not a book about Canada supporting or propping up anti-democratic governments around the world. It's about rather Canada's active or passive contributions to overthrowing democracy in countries all over the globe, which I think is a very important history to highlight at this particular moment as Justin Trudeau and his people participate in these summits for democracy, and they talk about foreign interference in Canadian democracy and all of these things. In reality, it's incredibly hypocritical for the Canadian government to call anybody else anti-democratic, and our hope is that this book will explain why. Of course, Trudeau himself or his government has been quite active in supporting coups against especially leftist governments and especially in Latin America, like with Bolivia, Peru, and Venezuela. But I'm not going to focus on Trudeau specifically for this presentation. Instead, I'm going to look at a few examples from countries that have been in the news quite a bit lately, outline their current situations, and explain how Canadian support for coups in those countries has led to the situations we see now. And to start, I want to talk about a country to which we devoted one of the book's more substantial chapters, and that's Haiti. And I want to use the current events in Haiti and also Canada's involvement in the 2004 coup there against Jean Bertrand Aristide as a way into some of the main issues that we tackle in the book. So obviously Haiti right now is mired in crisis. Former President Jovenel Moïse was assassinated 3 years ago, leading to the unelected Ariel Henry taking power with the backing of the so-called core group, of which Canada is an influential member. And since then, the people of Haiti have been on the streets protesting what is essentially the occupation of their country by foreign powers, with the so-called gangs, these paramilitaries, taking a lead role in the uprising. On March 11th, Ariel Henry, who has been linked to the assassination of Jovenel Moïse, resigned amidst this popular uprising, and since then the governance of Haiti has been largely up in the air. Henry, last time I checked, he was in Puerto Rico. He's not been able to return to Haiti, and following his resignation, the US, working with Caribbean countries through CARICOM, appointed an unelected council to govern Haiti. And it's not clear, to me at least, how much meaningful authority they have within the country at this moment. And it seems as though their appointment is being totally rejected by people on the streets. At the same time, however, these unelected rulers have been working with the Kenyan government to try to get Kenya to lead a police force into Haiti to fight the rebels. But so far, that force has not arrived. Canada has said that we will not directly participate in this new invasion of Haiti, but a recent CBC article has outlined that 70 Canadian Armed Forces members are currently in Jamaica to train the multinational force, which consists of several Caribbean countries, but led by Kenya. So Canada remains a participant here, but as our book outlines, Canada has long participated in the destruction of democracy and the imposition of external control in Haiti. So in short, Haiti right now is in a state of chaos and for all intents and purposes, civil war. And the question is, how did it get to this point? Well, we can trace the history back hundreds of years if we want to France forcing Haiti's revolutionary leaders to pay them the equivalent of $21 billion in exchange for independence. We can go back to the brutal US occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934. We could go through the Duvalier dictatorships, bringing us up to the late 1980s. But I think most relevant to Haiti's current crisis is the resounding election of left-wing President Jean Bertrand Aristide in Haiti's first free election in 1990. Aristide was a liberation theologian who promised to support the poor Haitian majority and fight the external exploitation of his country. For that, he was overthrown twice, first in 1991, and after being restored to power, he was overthrown again in 2004. And that 2004 coup is the one in which Canada played a very notable part. So Aristide was by far the most popular politician in Haiti because of his commitment to improving living conditions for the country's poor. But those policies which earned him the backing of so many Haitians made him an enemy of the US and the Canadian governments. Canada was deeply involved in the fight against Aristide's progressive reforms. And although Ottawa now makes a big deal about gangs in Haiti, I think it's fair to say Canada is one of the biggest gangsters in Haiti and has worked with other countries to repress democracy and progressive policies in Haiti for years. When Aristide's party, Famille Lavalas, won the May 2000 legislative elections, Canada worked to discredit them, claiming that there were irregularities and essentially that Lavalas had stolen the elections. Canada worked with the US to economically isolate Aristide, applying international pressure to cut off aid money and loans to Haiti. And working alongside the US, Canada, through CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, funded quote-unquote civil society organizations that were basically all anti-Aristide. These organizations labeled him a dictator, and they swept aside the opinions of the vast majority of Haitians in order to imply that Aristide was not a legitimate president and that his rule was criminal and unacceptable. External funding of these opposition groups led the situation to inflame. There were clashes, there was violence between the two sides. But even so, Aristide remained very popular into 2003, despite all of this external support that the opposition was receiving. And when it became clear that Aristide could not be toppled through these means, his opponents turned to insurgency, coup, and invasion. So in 2003, President Aristide had called on France to return the $21 billion it forced out of Haiti in 1825, an indemnity that began Haiti's cycle of poverty and dependency. France refused to pay it back, and together with Canada and the US, they began accelerating the plot to overthrow the democratically elected Aristide. That year, 2003, Canada hosted the so-called Ottawa Initiative on Haiti, where representatives from the US, Canada, France, and the OAS discussed Haiti's political future without a single Haitian present. According to a journalist from Quebec, Michel Bastel, representatives from Canada and these other countries openly discussed plans to remove Aristide, the elected president. So after this, violent anti-Aristide groups conducted cross-border raids across the Dominican Republic border into Haiti, and eventually they were able to surround Port-au-Prince. In this period, Aristide was asking for international support to protect his elected government, but that support did not materialize. What did happen was Canadian Special Forces secured the airport, US troops kidnapped Aristide, and he was flown out of the country against his will. So again, in February 2004, Aristide, the elected president of Haiti, was taken, kidnapped in his words, by US forces, brought to the airport, which had been secured by Canadian soldiers, and flown to the Central African Republic. While back in Haiti, outside powers, including Canada, decided on the country's future. This is how much Ottawa considered Aristide to be a threat. And of course, his anointed successor was a man from Florida who had not lived in Haiti for 15 years. And he promptly undid all of the gains of the Aristide period with the backing of Canada, the US, and their allies. And the dominant media in Canada went along with this, refusing to seriously interrogate why Aristide had been forced from power and which countries had been involved with the coup. So in Spring Magazine, my co-author Yves Engler writes that Jean Chrétien's liberals organized an international gathering to discuss overthrowing Haiti's elected government, recreating the Haitian military, and placing the country under UN trusteeship. 13 months after these meetings, President Jean Bertrand Aristide and most other elected officials were pushed out. In a striking example of subservience to power, the dominant media basically refused to investigate the Ottawa Initiative and has barely mentioned the meeting. A Canadian newsstand search more than a decade after the 2004 coup found not one single English language report about the meeting, except for mentions of it by Yves and two other Haiti solidarity activists. The dominant media largely ignored the Ottawa Initiative meeting, even though information about it was easily accessible online, and solidarity activists across the country referenced it repeatedly. So, after Aristide's overthrow, the United Nations Security Council formed the core group and the UN Stabilization Mission in Haiti, or MINUSTA, which for 13 years functioned as a violent occupation force. MINUSTA soldiers, whose ranks included hundreds of Canadians, participated in the massacre of Haitian civilians, the sexual assault of Haitian women, and they caused a cholera outbreak after the 2010 earthquake by dumping their sewage directly into Haitian drinking water. In Canadian Dimension, the authors Catherine Hughes and Jackie McVicker write, quote, "The core group and the countries and organizations with representation in it, including Canada, have had inordinate influence over Haitian governance and economics since the core group was founded almost 2 decades ago. They have used their influence to maintain an extremely inequitable economic system and have created a more favorable investment climate for textile factory owners, foreign apparel companies, and mining firms, among other business sectors. The imperial control that Haiti has been subjected to has led to dictatorship and corruption in Haitian governance, deep and entrenched inequality, violence, insecurity, and the inability of the state to carry out basic public functions." So this is the context in which the ongoing uprising in Haiti is taking place. The Haitians on the street are fighting against a system imposed on them by outside powers, including Canada, a system that is designed to keep them in a state of destitution. There was an off-ramp in the years where Jean Bertrand Aristide was president, but Canada, working with the US and France and others, made sure that off-ramp was not taken by conspiring in the removal of Aristide, the elected president. Now, this book is not just about Haiti. The 2004 coup against Aristide is one of about 20 such coups that we explore within its pages. But I start with Haiti tonight for 2 reasons. One, it seems to be in the news a lot lately, and in mainstream coverage, the context I've just outlined is totally omitted. And 2, it's a window into the true function of Canadian foreign policy, which is not to promote democracy around the world. Canadian foreign policy promotes democracy when it serves Canada's imperial interests. If it doesn't serve those interests, as in Haiti, then Canadian foreign policy tactics shift entirely, becoming thuggish and downright neo-colonial. It's also worth noting that the way Canada and its allies treat Haiti is utterly undisguised. It's naked imperialism for everyone to see. And while that makes it particularly shocking for some Canadians to learn about, it doesn't make interference in Haiti an exception. While Canadian interference in Haiti is particularly shameless, these same factors motivate Canadian interference in countries all around the world. even if in some of these countries, the interventions are more skillfully branded or disguised. So in the book, we also devote a chapter to Guatemala and the 1954 coup against the progressive leader there, Jacobo Arbenz. Like Haiti, like the removal of Aristide, the removal of Arbenz has had wide-ranging effects on life in Guatemala in the decades since. But Guatemala has also been in the news a bit lately because the newly elected president, Bernardo Arevalo, is a political outsider from the center-left Semilla party. While he's not a socialist, Arevalo has nonetheless faced a lot of opposition from the powers that be in Guatemala, which is significant because if he were to pursue some of these more progressive reforms, it would represent a major departure from the kind of elitist right-wing policies that have governed the country for decades following this Canadian-backed coup. So for background, in 1944, the US-backed dictator of Guatemala, Jorge Ubico, was removed in a pro-democracy uprising known as the Guatemalan Revolution. For the next 10 years, the country was governed by progressive presidents, first Juan José Arevalo and then Jacobo Arbenz. And one of the pillars of their program was land reform and land redistribution to benefit the peasantry. The US government opposed these reforms as they would hurt the profits of US fruit companies, and Eisenhower and the CIA launched Operation PB Success to remove Arbenz, the elected president, from power. And as we outlined in the book, Canada was supportive of the coup against Arbenz, and after the Guatemalan military dictatorship came to power with US backing, Canadian investment followed, especially in mining. So as the coup neared, Canada helped to isolate Arbenz. With the US seeking to destabilize his government, Arbenz wanted to demonstrate that Guatemala had cordial relations with Ottawa, key US ally, and thus his government was not a threat. Arbenz sent a request to Ottawa asking that they open embassies in each other's countries, again to show the US that the Arbenz government was not a threat. But Ottawa refused his request twice, first in 1953 and then again in 1954. In the book Northern Shadows, Peter McFarlane summarizes Canada's reaction to Arbenz's overthrow. He writes, "At external affairs and in Canadian corporate boardrooms, the coup against Arbenz was chalked up as another victory of the free world against the Soviet menace. But while Canadian diplomats and businessmen celebrated the coup against Arbenz, to Guatemalans themselves, it represented the total destruction of their fledgling democracy. Arbenz's successor, Castillo Armas, immediately outlawed peasant organizations and unions and reversed the previous 10 years of agrarian reform. The coup led to a series of dictatorships, the genocide against the indigenous Mayan people, and a 3-decade-long civil war that cost more than 100,000 lives. The civil war lasted until 1996, but the entrenched power, the Guatemalan oligarchy, and the right wing persists, which is what made Bernardo Arevalo's election victory last year so significant. And as the book Testimonial by Catherine Nolan and Graham Russell explains, Canadian mining investment benefited immensely from the 1954 coup against Arbenz and the right-wing economic policies of the military dictatorship and the continued subjugation and dispossession of Indigenous people in the country. This is because Canadian business interests and the ability of Canadian firms to invest and reap profits abroad are a defining factor in Canada's engagement with the world. It isn't about values. It's not about the promotion of freedom or democracy or anything like that. The foreign policy of the Canadian capitalist state is defined by the interests of the capitalist class, and it's as simple as that. And in each of these chapters, each of these case studies in Canadian imperialism, we illuminate this reality in different ways. So in the book, we also investigate the 1953 coup in Colombia, which brought to power General Rojas Pinilla. The Canadian government supported this coup because, as Lester B. Pearson laid out at the time, the coup government wanted to buy Canadian airplanes, and that purchase would have greatly benefited the Canadian aerospace industry. In 1966, Canada supported the coup against the leader of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. Canadian-trained officers even participated in this coup. And after that, Canadian mining companies flooded Ghana, and there's still a massive presence there today. And in 1973, Canada supported General Augusto Pinochet's coup against the elected socialist president Salvador Allende. And in subsequent years, Canadian mining investment in Chile skyrocketed. Again, like Haiti and like Guatemala, these are only a few examples, but they touch on that essential reality of Canadian foreign policy that I'm talking about. It's not a question of values in Canadian foreign policy, but of cold, calculated, material interests. And of course, this contrasts greatly with how Canada brands itself globally. And I want to read here an excerpt to emphasize that fact. Canada supports democracy around the world. The leaders of this country promote free and fair elections, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press. At least that's what Canadian officials say. Lester B. Pearson waxed eloquent about, quote, the struggle of free, expanding, progressive democracy against tyrannical and reactionary communism. Pierre Trudeau lauded, quote, the freedom of individuals and of nations, the political freedom which distinguishes East from West. To justify Canada's 2004 intervention in Haiti, Prime Minister Paul Martin talked about the primacy of democracy to economic development, while Stephen Harper's Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird declared that, quote, Canada will continue to support people who are seeking to bring freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law to their respective countries. In 2019, Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland claimed that Canada supported Ukraine because the country was, quote, at the forefront of the struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. Well, a 2021 release from Justin Trudeau was titled Prime Minister Focuses on Protecting Democracy at Summit for Democracy. Alongside the pro-democracy rhetoric, the federal government has instigated various initiatives with the ostensible aim of promoting democracy. In 1988, the Brian Mulroney government set up the International Center for Human Rights and Democratic Development. In 2009, Harper opened a South America-focused democracy promotion center at the embassy in Lima, while the Canadian Fund for Local Initiatives, a financing mechanism overseen by diplomatic outposts, lists democracy as a top concern. Echoing government officials, the media regularly suggests that Canada seeks to promote democracy. They frame conflicts with countries ranging from China to Russia to Iran as motivated by a belief in democracy. At the more critical end of the mainstream discussion, commentators sometimes complain that Ottawa does business with or maintains ties to undemocratic regimes. In the years before this book went to print, there was significant criticism of Canada selling light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia. In an earlier period, there was some criticism of Canada's ties to Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and Suharto in Indonesia, as well as Marcos in the Philippines, Duvalier in Haiti, and the Shah in Iran. There is, in fact, an underexplored history of Canadian officials supporting autocratic and repressive regimes. But this book is not about Canada accommodating to an unjust world by passively or actively supporting dictatorships. Rather, it is about Ottawa passively or actively subverting elected governments around the world and why it has done so. Canada has repeatedly endorsed US-backed military coups against elected, usually progressive leaders. As we show, Canada has passively supported the ouster of or actively contributed to the overthrow of at least 20 elected governments. Ottawa passively supported the removal of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, Guatemalan Prime Minister Arbenz in 54, Dominican Republic leader Juan Bosch in 63, Brazilian President João Goulart in 64, and on, Indonesia, Uganda, Paraguay, Brazil, Peru. There are many more examples in the book: Bolivia, Gaza, Ghana, Congo, Ukraine, Venezuela. But before closing out this section of the talk, I just want to emphasize something else that I think is very important. I want to stress that the Canadian states' long fight against democracy around the world in places like Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia is also a domestic phenomenon. In other words, the Canadian government has long undermined democracy here on this land to promote corporate or capitalist interests, especially targeting Indigenous forms of governance. And it's been this way since the beginning. The colonial state has undermined Indigenous forms of government and removed Indigenous leaders for being too independent. So here, as well as abroad, Canada has always represented democracy for some and authoritarianism for others. Mirroring its support for coups abroad, Canada has a long history of undermining other nations' politics. British and French colonizers destroyed Indigenous governance structures, which had often served First Nations well for hundreds of years. They liquidated Mi'kmaq leaders in the Maritimes and bombed First Nations chiefs into submission on the West Coast. Since Confederation, the federal government has undermined Indigenous governments in innumerable ways. In 1870 and 1885, British and Canadian troops violently repressed two rebellions against the expansion of colonial rule into Western Canada. Louis Riel, a prominent leader of these resistance movements and founder of Manitoba, was hanged by the Canadian government in 1885. For a century, so-called Indian agents oversaw politics on reserves, and the 1876 Indian Act subverted Indigenous governance. To instill dependence on Indian affairs, the federal government imposed band councils on hundreds of First Nations. The Indian Act undercut direct democracy and governing structures linked to distinct land and cultural practices. For over half a century, women and hereditary chiefs were largely excluded from band council politics. And Ottawa continues to subvert First Nations self-governance, and they've intervened to prevent more democratic decision-making. In recent years, Canada has repeatedly jailed band council leaders. In 2008, for instance, the chief, deputy chief, and 4 other members of the Big Trout Lake Council were imprisoned for their opposition to mining operations on their reserve, 600 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, Ontario. And much like how First Nations were targeted by the state to acquire their land and wealth, governments targeted for coups around the world have often pursued political, economic, and social reforms that anger the corporate set. In many cases, Canadian-backed coups have led to the reversal of these reforms and created direct money-making opportunities. For instance, after Pinochet's 1973 coup against Allende, Timothy David Clark notes, quote, "Canadian mining companies were leaders in the stampede of foreign investment to Chile. Between 1974 and 2003, Canada was the 3rd largest single investor in the country, behind the United States and Spain. In the 3 decades after Allende was overthrown, Canadian companies owned most of Chile's largest mining projects." And I'll stop reading there so we can begin to wrap up this first half. I'll just conclude by saying that our hope with this book is that it will contribute to generating an interest in the realities of Canadian foreign policy, not the myths that are so often peddled about our government's supposed values and how those values drive its engagement with the world. The book itself is short, and the chapters are generally more overviews than extended deep dives into these particular events. But ideally, the book would serve to both educate readers and pique their interest so that they dig deeper into these issues themselves, whether it be the coup in Haiti or Guatemala or Chile or anywhere else. And the hope is that they'll feel compelled to broaden their understanding of Canadian foreign policy beyond the myths and beyond the propaganda and to educate others. So thank you everybody for coming out and for contributing to this process of education and of understanding. We'll now go into the conversation portion of the launch.
Right again.
Testing.
Figured it out.
Thanks, Owen, for reading again and going over those sections on Guatemala and Haiti that Like you said, the book summarizes very expertly and concisely in the book. This was definitely like a really great read for me. And as you spoke to at the end, I definitely did get it like a really, you know, it's an unfortunate overview, but a wide-ranging overview of Canadian foreign policy. And yeah, definitely learn more here than I probably would have in a few years of just listening to the CBC. Put it that way. So my first question was sort of more a question of overview and process. It's a little bit of a multi-part question, but I'll try to go as smoothly as possible to track all the parts. So I guess the first part was, how did the idea for this book come up between you and Eve? I know that you're both regular columnists of Canadian Dimension, so I guess we'll just start there.
Yeah, so I had been aware of Eve's work for a long time before I started writing for Canadian Dimension. When I was like 19 or 20 years old, his books were really influential for my politicization, especially Canada in Haiti and Canada in Africa. And I really liked his style because it doesn't come across as polemical. He really just presents events as they happen. He just documents the facts, explains what was Canada's role in the coup against Aristide, what has been Canada's role in West Africa, in Southern Africa, in all these different places. So he was somebody I really wanted to work with, but he didn't become aware of my work until I had been a columnist at Canadian Dimension for a few years. And then he actually reached out to me and asked if I had any ideas about topics that we could collaborate on, eventually leading toward a full-length book. So we kicked around a few ideas and eventually settled on this idea of Canada versus democracy. It's something that really resonated with both of us because it seemed like an essential topic, but one that hadn't really been covered in a single book, like actually compiling all of these coups, documenting Canada's role, and just going chapter by chapter through each example. It wasn't anything that we had seen before. So that idea really resonated for both of us.
Turn on all the time. Oh, there we go. On that same point, you said that it's a book that both of you hadn't seen before. Why do you think that's so? I mean, because there's been books, and you cited some books that were specific to specific countries and situations, but at the end of your introduction, you said, kind of summed it up, more on a global scale. As you spoke to at the end of your introduction, there hasn't been a book like this to cover Canada's intervention in countries more on a global scale. It's always been very individualized and more of an individualized deep dive. So why do you think a book like this hasn't existed yet?
Yeah, that's a question I've thought about a lot because if you look at, for example, like histories in the US, there's a huge literature on the US government's involvement in coups around the world and subverting democracies around the world. I was thinking of a book by Stephen Kinzer. It's just called Overthrow. And he does a similar thing. He just lists all of these examples of US-backed coups or US orchestrated coups and just goes through each one. But it seemed like until now there hadn't been a Canadian counterpart to that. And I think there's two explanations, one related to the mainstream and the other to kind of left publishing, because there is a very vibrant left and anti-imperialist publishing scene in Canada. On the mainstream side, though, this fact that Canada undermines democracy around the world is just not accepted as fact. That is treated as sacrilege, basically, because you're undermining these myths that are so important to Canadians and to their understanding of their country. So you don't get anything like that in the mainstream. On the left publishing side, though, you're right, we do get a lot of deep dives into certain topics, like Canada and Afghanistan, Canada and Haiti. There's a growing literature on Canadian mining investment around the world and the adverse effects that has on all of the countries involved. But yeah, there just hasn't been a book like this published that I'm aware of, that Eve was aware of, that our publisher was aware of. And I think the short answer to that on the left side of things is just nobody has thought to do it until now.
And I guess my last question about process is, how did you and Eve kind of split up the work? What did that look like? Were one of you experts in particular areas, or had any interest in particular areas? And sort of the second question that kind of popped into my head as you were talking about the fact that you looked up to Eve quite a bit, and he was somebody that you wanted to work with. Did you ever find your writing style or process change as you worked with him, whether for this book or even to your work in Canadian Dimension? Do you find your writing style change with that just in working with him?
Yeah, that's a good question. The first part of it, the process, we did initially kind of send each other lists of countries that we felt the most comfortable and the most confident writing about. So just countries that we had done research about in the past, countries that maybe we had written on in the past, and then also countries that we wanted to investigate further. So Eve had done a lot of work on Haiti, obviously. He wrote a book about it. He had done a lot of work on Ukraine 2014, who there. I had done quite a bit on like Guatemala 1954, things like that. So we just like identified areas where we were most confident, then started going from there. And the collaborative process then was really interesting to me because we would send each other chapters as we wrote them and edit each other's work. And Eve's edits on my work were always like cuts or compression. If you've ever read his work, it's very efficient. He just like lists what happened, he adds a citation, and you get a very clear picture right off the bat. My edits on Eve's work were more like adding historical context, adding information around the coup. So it was like a total opposite. But I think that in that back and forth, we were able to produce chapters that include all of the relevant information, but also have all of the relevant context without feeling like there's too much. And as for the second part, like, has my writing style changed since working with Eve? I don't know if it's changed a whole lot, but I've definitely, I think I have a better eye for efficiency now and for like cutting out anything that might be extraneous or might be slowing the reading down and just like really getting at the essential facts and listing them without having too much context or additional information.
Okay, well, my next question is going to be, I'm hoping you can expand then on one of the chapters. So one of the early chapters of the book talks about the overthrow of the first democratically elected prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, of the then Republic of the Congo, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. First, can you explain the situation a little bit more and how Canada helped kind of start the fire in that country, and then subsequently appeared to come to the rescue of Lumumba? And then I guess, was there anything in the research that suggested if Lumumba knew Canada supported the violent secessionist movements in Katanga that had led to his eventual overthrow and then murder?
Yeah, so what you're talking about there is the Congo crisis, right? And the Congo crisis and Canada's role in the UN mission there looms pretty large in the myth making around Canadian peacekeeping ventures. So I think it's really important to talk about. And as for background, Patrice Lumumba, like you say, he was the first elected prime minister of Congo, takes power in June 1960. He has a background in freedom fighting. He was a liberation fighter against the Belgian colonial apparatus. He was imprisoned for 81 days while waging that struggle. And when he comes to power, he is a Pan-Africanist. He's an anti-imperialist. And he begins forging ties with other Pan-Africanist leaders on the continent, especially Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. He was the author of Neocolonialism, the famous book that explained how after the end of formal colonialism, Western powers still continue to economically and politically dominate the continent. Lumumba also forged positive ties with the USSR, which in the context of the Cold War definitely raised some eyebrows in the West. And perhaps most importantly, he began to cut the West out of Congo's very lucrative mineral sector. Congo is a very, very rich country. It just is a poor people because of all of this outside exploitation. So yeah, he comes to power in 1960, and pretty much immediately this secessionist movement in the eastern province of Katanga, a very rich province, declares its independence. And Lumumba is panicked, and he goes to the UN to help resolve this situation, and they send a force into Congo. But seemingly unbeknownst to him, the UN and the leader of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, as well as the president of the US and the Prime Minister of Canada, John Diefenbaker, are all aligned against him, and they support the secessionist movement in Katanga. And as this situation develops, Lumumba becomes more and more aware, it seems, of this fact. Like John Diefenbaker, he made it clear in private conversations that he considered Lumumba a major threat to Western interests, and that he thought supporting the Katanga secessionists would be the best way to undermine Lumumba and so to defend Canadian interests on the continent. Lumumba becomes more and more suspicious of the Canadians as the UN mission goes on. Reportedly, his close advisors are telling him that Jean Bertrand, this major Canadian colonel in the force, is an imperialist tool and is plotting against him. Eventually, Lumumba, in public, refers to Canada as just another imperialist country. And the situation develops from there. The Congolese president, Kasavubu, fires Lumumba. He dismisses him as prime minister, puts him under house arrest. Lumumba escapes. And then Jean Bertrand, this Canadian colonel, alleges that he was the one who called Joseph Mobutu, gave him Lumumba's location, and Mobutu's forces kidnapped Lumumba. They tortured him, killed him, cut up his body, and dissolved it in acid. And if we are to believe this Canadian colonel, Jean Bertrand, he was the one who caused this by giving Mobutu Lumumba's location. And yeah, like I say, I think Lumumba became more and more suspicious of these outside forces as the mission wore on. I think he probably underestimated how blatantly the Western countries would meddle in his own country through the UN, how much the UN under Dag Hammarskjöld was against him. But yeah, after he's out, eventually Mobutu comes to power, rules Congo as a dictator, and under his rule, Canada has very positive relations with Congo. Mobutu has a lot of very important Canadian advisors who are extremely close to him. Canadian mining companies buy into Congo, start exploiting the mineral resources in there, something that probably would not have been possible under Lumumba. And yeah, that's the situation until Mobutu is eventually forced from power. But yeah, as I said at the beginning, this Congo crisis still looms large in myth-making around Canadian peacekeeping, and it's often portrayed positively, which to me is quite incredible, because if you actually look at the history of this situation, Canada's hands are soaked in blood from the beginning to the end.
One final question before turning it over to the audience for Q&A. A pair of chapters I also found interesting were the chapters about Canada's interventions in Russia in the 1990s, and then subsequently the Ukraine in the early 2010s. In the case of Russia, Canada gave increased moral and monetary aid to Boris Yeltsin's government as it rapidly transitioned away from communism. Then come the early 2010s, we see Canada suddenly using Cold War and anti-communist rhetoric around Russia's actions towards Ukraine, framing Russia as if they had in fact remained communist since Yeltsin's transition, is sort of how I was kind of reading the rhetoric going around. So I guess kind of generally speaking, can you unpack this attitude a little bit more for us? Why Canada continues to use this rhetoric when it, a few decades ago, was supposedly no longer applied to Russia's situation?
Yeah, so you've identified two chapters there from the book, Russia 1993 and Ukraine 2014. And these are two coups that Canada had a very notable role in. So I think it's important to unpack these a little bit. So Russia 93, Boris Yeltsin, He is, with the backing of the US and Canada and Europe, implementing these shock therapy reforms on the country to transition it toward capitalism. And in this process, millions of Russians are impoverished, their savings vanish overnight. There are millions of excess deaths across the former Soviet Union because of these policies, and it's actually the largest recorded mortality increase outside of wartime in a country in recorded history because of these shock therapy reforms. So Yeltsin is opposed by the vast majority of the Russian people. The elected parliament begins to oppose his shock therapy reforms when they realize the catastrophic effect they're having on Russia. And Yeltsin responds to this by bombing his parliament building, by massacring protesters, by shutting down opposition press, and by strengthening the presidential system so that he can go around parliament if he needs to, something that Vladimir Putin would take advantage of when he succeeds Yeltsin. But at the time, Yeltsin was a very important ally of the West, of Canada, of the US, and of Europe. So he was our guy. We approved of everything. We never criticized his actions, the bombing of the parliament, the coup against his own parliament. In order to continue with these shock therapy reforms, he sold out his country and his people hated him, but it didn't matter because he was on our side. And Canada, as I say, he supported all of this. They sent advisors to Yeltsin throughout the 90s. They praised Yeltsin to the heavens in public statements. So we were definitely involved and complicit in that coup. And then, Ukraine 2014, it's the same thing. But what's interesting there is that under Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine at the time, Canada's criticism of his government was often framed in anti-communist terms, or like the Canadian embassy spokesperson at the time said that Yanukovych was like restoring the Soviet past. Stephen Harper said the same thing, that Yanukovych wanted to rebuild the Soviet empire, as though the Russian influence in Ukraine meant that they were restoring communism in Ukraine. It's very ahistorical. And there's a contradiction there, as you point out, because Canada helped to build Russian capitalism, but in regard to Ukraine, we were framing Russia as though it were still communist. And it's not as though they didn't know. I mean, the Canadian government was involved in Russia throughout the 90s, as I say. But there's a few things to point out regarding this framing. One is that in Canada, there's a very large and very organized and very right-wing Ukrainian diaspora lobby that will often frame Russia as synonymous with authoritarianism, it's communism by implication, and that's how they frame the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And of course, that filters up to the Canadian government. But the Canadian government also has geopolitical reasons for wanting to pursue this framing as well. So they definitely, it's not as though they're being manipulated. They have reasons to frame the conflict in this way. It's democracy against authoritarianism. We've all heard it. But yeah, I mean, another thing to point out regarding Russia would be that there have been some significant changes since Yeltsin left power. The major one being that Putin, his government, made it harder for the West to get what it wanted to get out of Russia. And at first, the West supported Putin. Once they realized he would be harder to work with, suddenly we discovered he's an authoritarian. As though Yeltsin wasn't, as though Putin was going to restore the Soviet Union, which is ridiculous, after these beautiful and prosperous years under Boris Yeltsin. This was the framing of it. But I think what this goes to show is that Canadian messaging will adapt based on the situation. So in Russia in 93, it benefited Canada to frame Yeltsin as this capitalist who would also support like freedom of the press and democracy and elections and all of this. And then Ukraine in 2014 and onwards, it is beneficial for the Canadian government to frame it as Russia wanting to restore the Soviet Union. Yeah, the messaging will adapt based on the situation in whatever way the Canadian government thinks will garner the most public support. That's what I'd say.
Thanks for unpacking that a little bit more, Owen. If we can go into the Q&A, does anybody in the audience here online have any questions?
I was just wondering, what is your analysis regarding the present situation in the war in Europe, the relationship of Canada, Ukraine, Canada, NATO, and the possibility of third world?
What was the question? What does Owen make of
What is your so the continued situation in Europe?
situation in Europe, or are you hinting at some sort of greater conflict?
Particularly the role that Canada is playing in supporting Ukraine war against Russia.
Yeah, so I would say Canada's role in Ukraine for a long time, especially since 2014, and then of course with the Russian invasion, has been negative in the sense that it is always inflaming the conflict. It's never concerned with how to make, like, for instance, these two opposing camps in Ukraine, the Western more pro-West side, the Eastern more pro-Russia side, how to get them to reconcile and live together. Canadian policy in the country has always been very firmly pro-Western Ukraine, even as the conflict and the tensions ramped up, culminating in the 2014 coup, and then really becoming like violent and brutal with the Russian invasion. And I mean, yeah, after the Russian invasion, well, even before then, in 2014, when the Donbass war kicks off, Canada launches Operation Unifier to train all these Ukrainian regiments as they go into the Donbass to fight the separatists. And then with the Russian invasion, Canada ramps up support and continues to ramp up support, even as now it's becoming clear that this is at best a stalemate and at worst just the slow destruction of Ukraine. But Canada up to this day is really not looking for a peaceful way out of this situation, not promoting negotiations. It's just more arms shipments, things like that. And as you say, the risk of third world war is always there, especially when we look to the situation in Gaza now, the genocide there, tensions between Iran and Israel. I mean, Israel just bombed the Iranian consulate in Syria. Iran has vowed a response. The US has said that any response, the American government will respond to that. So there's the risk of a tit for tat there in the Middle East. There's the continued war in Ukraine. It's a terrible and frightening situation. And I think Canada, in every instance, is inflaming the conflict rather than looking for a way out, if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm originally come from Chile, like my wife and fellow friends back here. And we lived the experience of what it was the military coup in Chile, supported entirely by the interests of American imperialists, and Canada involved on the coup. We ended up with near 30,000 people being assassinated. 10,000 people came to Canada and other part of the world, and so on and so on and so on. But Canada followed the path of the geopolitical situation according to American imperialism, mainly. Canada became, that's one of the things I don't understand what they call Canada democratic, sovereign, free country, when Canada is still a colony of the British Empire and depends militarily and financially for an American imperialism interest in Canada. So besides all the involvement of Canada has around the world, the most scary part is the inside politics in Canada. Because right now, you cannot have an opinion what the government of Canada say about things. Because if you say something, the Canada government don't like it, you might have the CISA or the RCMP knocking your door right now. Furthermore, just a couple of days ago, I heard the news, not the news mainstream, but even if you post an opinion against the Canadian government on Facebook or Instagram or any social media, you can be subject to be a question. So our democracy, and quotation mark, is in danger. Regarding to the geopolitical situation in the world right now, the Canadian involvement in Ukraine is, along with American interest and the British interest and the NATO interest in Ukraine, because after the 2014 coup that happened in Ukraine, they want to make Ukraine part of NATO. And being part of NATO, they want to put bombs and nuclear bomb right in the border with Russia. So the invasion of Russia is not an invasion, it's a special operation. And Russia said, we don't accept Ukraine to be part of NATO. We don't want nuclear weapons for NATO and our border with Russia. And that's the whole conflict all about. The Canadian press doesn't say anything about the Canada has 500 mercenaries being killed in Ukraine.
Sorry, is there a question for Owen?
Wait,
in
wait.
this?
Don't interrupt me. And
Is there a question
Yes.
for Owen in this? Okay.
So you don't like what I'm saying?
I don't care about what you're saying. I just need to make sure other people can ask questions too.
This is a demographic speech. She tried to stop to say what I said. So, in your opinion, how the Canadian people, how we can open the mind of the Canadian people to realize the Canadian foreign policy to become a real democratic policy?
Yeah, so the question being there, like, how do we together open the minds of the Canadian people, kind of see through this propaganda to organize in order to save some of these democratic rights that we might have? It's a big question. I think organization is a big and important thing here. Just organizing at a grassroots level, at a community level, around these different political issues, for sure. Pressuring people in government. I mean, right now, for instance, with the genocide in Gaza, it's really heartening that there are these weekly rallies across the country. I mean, in the larger cities in Canada, of course, they're much bigger. It's thousands of people marching every week. But also in the smaller cities, in Winnipeg and in Saskatoon, these marches are happening constantly, which is very heartening to see. And yeah, I think just the answer to your question, I don't really have an answer. I think that always community organizing is important. Talking to people is important. The book that me and Eve wrote, I think if it were able to contribute to that in some way, I would be a happy person. Even just like opening people's minds a little bit more, just a few people, that would make me a happy person. But I think you definitely raised some important issues, and especially around the coup in Chile. I would be interested in talking to you afterward about your experience of that. But thank you.
Kind of going off of this gentleman's questions, could you shed more light on like where you want the education to go towards, like what would you want people to gain from this book, like in a synopsis, like bullet points? Also, if that's too big, I'm looking for more information on like when you're talking about the economic opportunities that Canada is as justification for all of these actions. Like which, outside of the mining industry, are there specific corporate giants that are playing a big role? Are there other industries that are also like the general Canadian consumer should be aware of?
Yeah, so I guess the first part of that question was like, what specifically do I hope that people get out of this book? And I think it's the same for like all of my nonfiction work, my historical or political work. I just want people to see through the myths that are so often circulated about Canadian policy around the world and domestically. You know, Canada is very good at branding itself as a peacekeeper, as a promoter of democracy. But you actually look into like the nitty-gritty of some of these situations, you realize it's just the opposite. So I hope that this book, that my first book on Afghanistan, would be able to do that for some people, would be able to broaden the conversation just a little bit. And as for the second part, are there specific industries that people should be aware of regarding Canadian foreign policy? And the Canadian mining industry, I think, is the big one that a lot of people don't know about. I mean, Canada is home to 75% of the world's mining companies. They have a major economic influence in Canada. I mean, there have been studies that show that Canada's foreign policy relations with different countries is influenced by its openness to mining investment.
you expand on what kind of mining like that?
All kinds of mining, gold, silver. In Chile, it's copper is the big one. Across South America, it's copper. Lithium is becoming the new white gold, they call it. So the lithium triangle in South America, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, all of these countries with lithium. The coup in Peru in 2022, for instance. Right before that happened, President Pedro Castillo was saying that he was going to work toward nationalizing the lithium sector, work toward nationalizing these minerals. And then he's out in a coup suddenly that Canada supports. So I think the mining industry is the big one. There are, of course, other Canadian industries that benefit from imperialism. In Haiti, a big one is textiles. But it varies based on which country you go. Libya is a country, we don't talk about it in the book, but like Canadian oil interest in Libya, I think, probably played a big role in Canada's decision to join the attack against Libya in 2011. So there are all of these economic interests, all tied in with Canadian foreign policy, all influencing Canadian foreign policy, and they are so little discussed. So going back to the first part of the question, if people can just become more aware of some of these industries, of this economic incentive in Canada's interventions around the world, then I'll think that this book and my other work has achieved something. Ready to wrap up?